This is a brief lecture that just kind of reviews over the main concepts about the endocrine system that you learned about in Bio 201 202 in order to get your head kind of in the space of endocrine system so that when we start talking about disorders of the endocrine system, it will hopefully make sense. Now, the first thing I want to do is make sure everybody remembers clearly what the word endocrine means and how it varies from the word exocrine. We have both endocrine and exocrine glands in the body. Endocrine glands release their manufactured proteins or lipids, whatever they may be, the hormones, directly into the bloodstream. And, well, not directly. They release it outside the cell, and then it diffuses through the capillary and into the bloodstream. By comparison, exocrine glands release their contents directly into a lumen. That lumen could be the lumen of the small intestine. It could be the lumen of a sweat gland that reaches to the surface of the skin. It could be the lumen outside of a salivary gland called your mouth. Some glands can have both endocrine and exocrine function. Take example for the ovaries. The ovaries release eggs, and they also produce hormones such as estrogen. The released estrogen diffuses out of the cell and into the nearby blood. That's an endocrine product. The eggs that are produced by the ovaries are released into the surrounding lumen or area surrounding the ovaries and eventually swept into the uterine or fallopian tubes. That's considered an exocrine product. Now, there are, aside from just regular hormones, there are other types of signal molecules that can also affect cells. These are called paracrines and autocrines. Paracrines are basically short-range hormones. These are signal molecules that cause a cell to do something different, and it only impacts neighboring cells, cells adjacent to the cell that secreted it. By comparison, autocrines are those signal molecules which influence the cell that actually secreted it. So here's my cell. It secretes some little molecule, signal molecule, and that signal molecule directly comes back and impacts the cell that made it in the first place. Now, there are different classes of hormones. Generally speaking, we have a whole lot of peptide-derived hormones in the body. These are made of amino acid chains. There are steroid-based hormones, things that are made from the precursor molecule cholesterol, and they include things like testosterone, androgen, progesterone, estrogen, etc., glucocorticoids, and monoamines. Okay, this is, whoops, I spelled that wrong, monoamines. Monoamines are also called biogenic amines, that's another name for them, and they're derived from the amino acid tyrosine, with the exception of one biogenic amine called melatonin that's made from tryptophan. But biogenic amines include things like norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and thyroid hormone. And the reason I've lumped them together with the steroids is that all of these behave in a hydrophobic manner, meaning that they do not mix well with water, but they do mix very well with other lipids. And then the third class of hormones are the paracrines, which I mentioned before in the previous slide. Most of these paracrines are a type of eicosanoid. And eicosanoids, you'll remember, are those different types of molecules that we make from arachidonic acid. And things like, if we use lipoxygenase as our enzyme to convert arachidonic acid, we can make things like leukotrienes. If we use the cyclooxygenase to be the conversion factor for our arachidonic acid, then we produce eicosanoids like prostacyclin, thromboxanes, prostaglandins, etc. Those are all collectively called eicosanoids. And an eicosanoid is basically just any molecule derived from the 20-carbon chain that we started with that was called arachidonic acid. So these are the different classes of hormones. And the reason I care about highlighting this is, you're going to see in a minute when I remind you, peptide hormones signal cells in a different way than do steroid-based hormones. And that is because you remember that the plasma membrane of all cells is a phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid bilayers are highly hydrophobic. which means that steroids and monoamines that play well with lipids have the ability to pass right through that phospholipid bilayer and move inside the cell, and sometimes even through the nuclear envelope and into the nucleus itself, and then have its effects. By comparison, peptide hormones are hydrophilic. They are water-loving, which means that they do not easily cross that plasma membrane. As a result, they tend to have to bind to receptors on the surface of the plasma membrane and then rely on these secondary messenger systems involving the G protein and guanylate cyclase, etc., that's described here in order to activate certain metabolic changes inside of the cell. Now, hormones can have a multitude of actions. Sometimes hormones are upregulated, sometimes are downregulated, and what that has to do with is the receptors. Now, I can release a hormone into the body, and that hormone will circulate throughout the blood, throughout the body, but it will only impact cells in the body which have the proper receptor on their surface to recognize and respond to that hormone. So even though the hormone gets spread throughout the body, it really only impacts cells with the proper receptor. That means that hormones can have a high degree of specificity. They can impact only certain cells. It also means that we can reach a principle of what's called saturation, meaning that if every receptor on every cell is occupied with a molecule of hormone, it doesn't matter how much more hormone I produce. I have saturated all my receptors, and therefore I cannot stimulate any greater a response from the tissue. Now, different types of mechanisms of action that can happen once a hormone binds with its receptor include things like amplification. Amplification is a really common pathway. And what happens here is that, for example, we have just a couple of hormones, they bind to the receptors on a cell, but because of that secondary messenger system we talked about on the previous slide, a couple of those, just a couple of molecules of hormone can induce the production of a much larger quantity of cyclic AMP and protein kinases. And they, in turn, can activate a much larger pool of enzymes, which can then influence the production of some sort of molecule, lipid, protein, whatever it is, on a much larger scale. So we can amplify. Just a little bit of hormone can have a very large impact on a cell and its metabolic activities. That's called amplification. Upregulation occurs when I increase the total number of receptors. So, for example, here we can see that here's a cell that has 3 hormone receptors on it, and let's say that upregulation occurs. That means we're going to install even more of those hormone receptors on the surface of the cell, which means it's going to be even more sensitive. It's going to have greater sensitivity to that particular hormone. And a good example of this is the uterus in the late stages of pregnancy. Cells in the uterus will begin to, the smooth muscle cells in the uterus will begin to put a larger number of oxytocin receptors on the surface of those smooth muscle cells. And you'll remember oxytocin is what stimulates those smooth muscle cells to contract so that labor can progress and the baby can be delivered. So as we get closer to delivery date, we have more oxytocin receptors, so the uterus, once the oxytocin begins to be released, will be highly sensitive to that oxytocin. The opposite of upregulation, of course, is downregulation. And of course, this means I'm removing the total number of receptors on the surface so that I have fewer receptors, and it means I'm less likely to respond to the hormone, and I'm less sensitive. This sometimes will happen if hormone levels get really high. The cell will diminish its total number of receptors, so it's not overly responding. So a good example of this is if we look at adipose tissue. You look at adipocytes and insulin. And we're going to talk about this when we look at diabetes. One hypothesis, or one thing that we know that happens in type 2 diabetes, is there's so much insulin present in the blood that fat cells and other cells in the body actually remove some of the insulin receptors from the surface, and so they become less responsive to insulin. They become more tolerant of it, and so it takes higher and higher concentrations of insulin in order to induce any kind of response from those cells. There are lots of different types of ways that hormones can interact with each other. Sometimes two hormones can interact with each other in a synergistic fashion, meaning that the effect of the two of them combined together is greater than the additive effect of them. So, for example, follicle-stimulating hormone is a hormone that is both beneficial to females and males. In males, follicle-stimulating hormone helps to induce sperm production, but not very much. It assists a little bit. Testosterone also is needed to have adequate sperm production. But again, testosterone by itself, you wouldn't get enough sperm production to make a male clinically fertile. But when I combine these two together, the combination of the follicle-stimulating hormone with the testosterone synergistically increase the number of sperm produced in a multifactorial fashion. And so we get a huge increase in the amount of sperm production up to the point where the male is now considered to be fertile rather than infertile. Permissive effects occur when one hormone enhances the target cell response to another hormone that's coming soon. So, for example, the release of estrogen actually stimulates the upregulation of progesterone receptors on cells in the uterus. So the more estrogen I have, the more progesterone receptors I create, and thus I'll be more sensitive to progesterone. That's a permissive effect. And the last one I want to talk about is an antagonistic effect. I hope this one's fairly obvious. This means when two hormones act in a opposing manner. A great example of this is insulin and glucagon. You'll remember insulin is the hormone that induces cells to store sugar, to remove glucose from the blood. Glucagon, on the other hand, is what encourages cells to release glucose into the blood. So they have an opposite effect. Estrogen and prolactin are opposing hormones. So when estrogen levels are high, for example, during pregnancy, prolactin levels are inhibited from impacting breast cells so that the woman is not making breast milk while the baby is still developing. As soon as the baby's born, estrogen levels plummet, and thus prolactin is then allowed to impact the target cells of the breast and induce the production of breast milk. Estrogen and thyroid hormone, too, are also antagonistic. Now, one thing that we often see discussed in textbooks when going over the endocrine system is this idea of a hormonal axis, or axes is plural. A hormonal axis is simply the series of interactions or relationships among a number of endocrine organs. So, for example, a classic axis involves the hypothalamus, which signals the anterior pituitary, which then signals whichever appropriate target organ, such as maybe it's the thyroid gland, it could be the ovaries, maybe it's a liver, could be the liver, the adrenal glands, whatever it might be. That is an axis, and that axis is created or connected by the release of hormones. So even though the hypothalamus is discontinuous with the thyroid gland, because of this ability to secrete hormones into the blood, I can eventually have the hypothalamus impacting the thyroid gland via this axis or route that we discussed. The probably two pinnacle endocrine glands that are really essential to proper functioning of the endocrine system are the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So just to remind you very quickly, the hypothalamus is that portion of the brain whose primary responsibility is to maintain homeostasis. And it does things like regulate fluid intake and urinary output, temperature regulation, growth regulation, regulation of development of the gonads and production of egg and sperm. It's involved in all kinds of regulatory activities. And it's sort of like, I like to think of it like the general of the army. Okay, the general of the army decides, okay, this is what we're going to do. Here's the region of the brain where the hypothalamus is located. That's where the general is. And the general, just like in any army, there's a chain of command. If the general decides, okay, this is what we're going to do, then the general gives the order to a captain, for example. And the captain then, in turn, will tell the troops, okay, here's what we're going to do. The captain, if you will, in this axis is the pituitary gland. That's like the captain. It receives orders from the general, and then the captain disseminates those orders out to whichever target organ in the body is needed to respond. That would be the troops. Now, there's two parts to the pituitary gland, which is also called the hypophysis. Okay, we have the hypothalamus, and then the hypophysis is the pituitary gland. And there's two parts to the pituitary gland. There's the anterior pituitary, which is also called the adrenohypophysis. And then there's a posterior pituitary, which is called the neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary gland, even though it's located in the brain, is not neuronal tissue. It is glandular tissue, and it's actually derived from tissue in your pharynx, in the back of your throat, that during embryonic and fetal development, this region of the back of the throat actually migrates up into the brain and attaches underneath the hypothalamus to form the anterior pituitary. And that's why it's called the adenohypophysis. The adeno means relating to some sort of a gland. And this is the portion of the pituitary gland that is implicated in endocrine function. It manufactures a number of different hormones listed in this pink box here, things like luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, etc. And the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary gland is via something called a portal system. And you'll remember from your studies in 201 and 202 that a portal system is when I have one bed of capillaries connected to a second bed of capillaries without first going back to the heart. That's a portal system. Anytime I have one bed of capillaries connecting to a second bed of capillaries without first going back to the heart is a portal system. So we have one bed of capillaries in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes, releases certain hormones into that portal system. They travel down what's called hypothalamo portal system, and once they reach the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, those hormones stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary to other parts of the body, things like to the thyroid gland or the ovaries or the breasts or the adrenal glands, whatever it might be. The posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis, is actually neuronal tissue, and thus the name neurohypophysis. It is an extension of the hypothalamus, really, because the somas, the bodies of the neurons in the hypophysis, extend their axons down into the posterior pituitary and have their axon terminals down in that region. The bundle of axons that travel down from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Remember, a tract is a bundle of axons collectively bundled together that is present in the central nervous system. If we have the same structure, a bundle of axons all bundled together, and it was present in the peripheral nervous system, then we would call it a nerve. So the posterior pituitary is all neuronal tissue, and so communication between the hypothalamus and the neurohypophysis occurs via action potentials. In other words, all I have to do to get the posterior pituitary to release a hormone into the blood is to have these somas up here send an action potential down along their axons to the posterior pituitary where their axon terminals are, and they will then induce the release of hormone. And there's only two hormones that the posterior pituitary even releases, and those are ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and the other one is oxytocin, OT. Hopefully that gives you kind of a refresher of the lowdown of the endocrine system. We'll start looking at it in more details as we go through individual disorders in the coming lectures.